Okay, y'all can hear me? Can y'all hear? You're good? In the back there? Okay, well, welcome to our latest presentation. We have Richard Cronin talking about the Chase family and the Sunniland Dynasty. But anything to do with citrus, of course, we're all about, as you know. That's why a lot of you are here. We're in this room, this building is here, downtown Winter Garden is here because of citrus. So we honor that history, we collect its heritage, and basically we're all about the people who work for citrus, own the groves, work the groves. It's really the legacy of West Orange County, and we are proud to always present anything having to do with it. So tonight we're talking about the Chase family, some of whose members are in this room tonight, and related. And it's actually, you'd think, there's one family, but it's actually a lot. There's a lot.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, we're going to hear all about that tonight, and we thank you so much for the support. This is a great crowd, and thanks for coming out in this Arctic weather. It's freezing, so cold. And just 1 second about me, I'm having a little bit of a procedure, so that's why I'm wearing the baseball hat rudely in public. So thank you, Richard Cronin. Once again,
Jim, thank you so very much. All right, I'm ready, and just to show you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're going to hear me talk about several individuals tonight, so let me introduce you. Anna, Joshua, Sydney, Randall. We'll forget him because he's her husband. I'm not talking about him tonight. These are the Chase siblings that I've come to know over the last several months. I've written about a dozen, maybe some say 14, some say 15, somewhere in that range, different books about Central Florida. I did not bring any of them tonight, and I did not list them necessarily here tonight because you might note some egg on my face. The name Sidney and his family does not appear in any of my books. Shame on me, I know. My next book, however, they are chapter 1. Believe me. About 6 or 7 months ago, talking to Phil Cross about doing a presentation here, we discussed maybe doing the Chase family. I knew almost nothing about the Chase family. I had done a lot of research about early pioneers. Chase was just one family I had not really researched. So I said, sure, I always love a good challenge. I wanted to find out as much as I could about the Chase family. And oh my gosh, what I learned. I did not realize the early extent of their involvement, but you're going to hear a lot about it here tonight. To me, Sidney Chase and his siblings represent the American dream. But not only do they represent the American dream, they represent it twice. Starting from nothing, he built the Dynasty, lost it, and starting from nothing, rebuilt it. And that's what the subject here tonight is. An incredible family, but a family that really actually starts in 1869, and I explain why. In 1869, across the Cumberland Gap, came a gentleman by the name of Will Wallace Harney, who settled Pine Castle. You may have read about him if you read any of my books or anybody else's books. He's almost always mentioned. He left Louisville, Louisville, depending on where you're from, with a covered wagon, a wife, and a very young son, not even 1 year old yet, William Randolph Harney, who is the real reason for me mentioning this particular subject here. By the time he arrived in Central Florida, at Christmas time, just before Christmas time of 1869, his wife was so ill that they settled down, and she passed away within 3 weeks of them arriving. Not unheard of in Central Florida. Life was very, very challenging for men, and it was downright death-defying for women. Extremely hardships for any of the pioneers. But anyway, Will Wallace Harney happened to be a reporter before he came here. And he made his living by writing articles. Those articles are really, in fact, one of the earliest historical journals of Central Florida history. A good friend of mine, William Morgan from Pinecastle, took many of those articles and put it into an anthology. It's a book this thick. And my book happens to be in shatters. I've used it as references so very often. But Will Wallace Harney in 1870 lived right here in Orange County. But by the time the census takers came, he was 38, his son was 1 year old, and his wife had already passed. In 1870, Philadelphia was a city of 674,000. Now compare that to Orange County. It hadn't even reached 1,200 yet. Now when I talk about Orange County with a 1,200 or so residents, I'm talking about Seminole, Orange, Osceola, and half of Lake. All of that was Orange County. 1,200, 1,500 people at most lived in that entire area. Two of whom were the Harneys. But in Philadelphia in 1874 lived the Chase family. Edwin T. was a lawyer, his wife Lucia, and the children were Randall, Joshua, Sidney, Charles, and Anna. Charles is not a part of this subject because he stayed in Philadelphia, became a lawyer, I believe, was rather successful. But in 1870, they were all still living in Philadelphia, PA, in a city of 670,000. By Edwin T. Chase happened to be a descendant of Patriot Nathaniel Lowe Chase. And I point this out because every book that I'm writing now and every presentation I give, I go beyond the Civil War. I introduce the American Patriots because we're coming up on our 250th anniversary. And so in this particular case, Nathaniel was the great-grandfather of Edwin Theodore and the great-great-grandfather of the Chase siblings, American Patriots. This happens to be the proof of the Patriot because Joshua Coffin Chase, Sidney's brother, and one of the Chase siblings, actually had filed for the Sons of the American Revolution and was approved, which shows the lineage back to and who the Patriot was and what role they played in the Revolution. So let's now we're in 1871. Back here, the Harneys settled. 1871, on Christmas Day, a gentleman by the name of John Otto Freese came to Sanford. At that time, it was Orange County. And later, John Otto Freese became a surveyor. He became an Orange County surveyor, one of the most important Orange County surveyors. But he wrote later of what he encountered the first time he came to Orange County in 1871 on Christmas Eve. He wanted to come to Orlando and he couldn't find a way, so he climbed aboard a buggy and paid a gentleman, he and a couple other people, to take oxen cart all the way to Orlando. It took the greater part of the day. They didn't get there until nighttime, but he came to check out Orlando, and this is with the map of what he drew of Orlando in 1871, which is pretty accurate based upon what every other writings that we came from. The point is that there was really nobody here to any great extent in 1871 in that particular area. But in 1877, a gentleman wrote an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about his trip to Sanford, Florida. And what he wrote basically was that he saw the Sanford house, and they were charging $4 per day, probably too much because they weren't getting many guests. And he said the roads are nothing but tracks made by settlers' teams and never being worked on other than the large stumps removed. But there were a lot of northern and western families settled. They were doing sawmills, but some of them were trying to get into the seemingly profitable business of orange culture. This article is particularly interesting and appropriate for tonight's talk because in 1877, a 17-year-old boy decided to leave a city of 670,000 and come to Sanford, Florida, and try his luck at making a buck. In 1878, Sanford's dock was pretty much all that existed, that in a store. Henry Sanford was trying to develop a town of Sanford, but he was not doing very good at all. In 1878, there was still no railroad, and in 1878, Henry Sanford had only sold a couple lots in what was called the town of Sanford. The post office had only opened in 1873. So there wasn't hardly anything at Sanford when a young 17-year-old boy by the name of Sidney Octavia Chase showed up. In 1879, the very next year, a map was drawn of Orange County which showed Sanford and Mellonville. Prior to 1870, the only way to get into Orange County was Mellonville, down the Mellonville Road to Orlando. Henry Sanford was trying to do something different. He was trying to build a town and make his town a port town. So here on this 1879 map, I point out Bel Air. Bel Air was the first serious orange cultural grove in Orange County, and it was established by Sanford himself, and it was quite sizable, and it was on this Bel Air orange grove that a 17-year-old Sidney Octavia Chase came and started working as a laborer. There's a lot of interesting things happening as Sidney arrives in Sanford. Number one, Sanford, as I said, was not doing very well at developing his town. And so what he did was within a year after this is he sold Sanford to the English. And the English established a colony. Yeah, I know that was way back, but they actually called it a colony. The English bought all this for 65,000 pounds sterling. Don't ask me how much that is, I don't know. And so the English came in and they took effect. Well, the interesting thing about this map of 1879 was that it was prepared by an E.R. Trafford. E.R. Trafford was from England. He had been in England and for quite a while. He actually served in the Civil War. But it was his interest in Sanford as the first Orange County official surveyor that brought the Florida Land and Colonization Company, the English, to buy this property. So E.R. Trafford in 1879 was a pretty influential guy. His name was Edward Robert Trafford. He lived to 1906, but he only stayed in Orange County for a little while. But he's an important character for us to remember. So who's who of Lake Monroe? We have Henry Sanford himself. Even though he's not doing very well, he's determined to make Sanford a port town. Edward R. Trafford was the surveyor. Another young man that came in was James E. Ingraham. He began selling property for Sanford. But in 1880, when the very first meetings were scheduled to start talking about railroads, he was involved in those meetings. And he became the second president of the South Florida Railroad. One other interesting individual was Benjamin F. Whitner II. Benjamin F. Whitner II died in 1881, but prior to 1881, he had been the principal surveyor of Orange County south of Orlando. He surveyed 570 square miles of South Orange County, which at that time included Kissimmee. He knew exactly the path that a railroad should go. So Whitner, Ingram, Trafford, and Sanford were four of the primary individuals in Sanford as the young man Sidney Chase came to town. Back in 1880, to show you that Sidney was no longer with his siblings, we had Randall. By that time, Mom and Dad had both died. So Randall was in the fire insurance business in Philadelphia. An important item to remember as we proceed. Anna had yet to marry, and Joshua was still there, and Charles F. was still there, a student to become a lawyer. So Sidney was down here by himself, and his siblings were still back in Philadelphia. In 1880, the owners of the Boston Herald, as you may or may not know, they actually financed the very first railroad, the railroad from Sanford to Orlando, the South Florida Railroad. So that became a pivotal year. The very first train arrived November 11th of 1880 and changed everything. And one of the early locomotives just happened to be called the Herald. In 1881, an interesting article appeared in the Florida Agriculturalist because Mr. Ingram, whenever Mr. Ingram was absent from Bel Air and Sanford, he was representing General Sanford, S.O. Chase, the clerk, was in charge of operations. Interesting. So by this time, he's 21 years old, and he's already climbing the ladder in Orange County. Bel Air is an interesting grove in that eventually the Chase family owned Bel Air Grove. There was something else I wanted to point out in here. I guess absent sent to England. Again, Ingraham represented the English people, the owners of Sanford. They were purportedly unhappy with the way General Sanford ran things back in Orange County, and so they frequently had to go and settle everybody's nerves back there that everything was going all right. And Ingraham became a very influential and powerful individual. Also in 1881, an interesting thing happened. In the words of Sidney Octavius Chase himself, he wrote this many years later, he was walking down the street in Sanford when he happened upon a gentleman whose last name happened to be Chase. According to Sidney, they ended up, before they knew him, they actually had a very long and cordial acquaintance and friendship. Who was Loring Chase? Loring Chase had been a real estate developer in Chicago, and he was down looking for land to purchase and develop a town. Well, as it turned out, he had gone down the Indian River, couldn't find anything, and somebody told him he should check out Sanford and Lake Monroe area, so he came here. He was getting ready to leave when he met Sidney Octavius Chase on the street. And Sidney says, I have a piece of property. Let me show you around. So he showed him all around Sanford. And Loring said, I still don't see anything I really like, so I'm going to leave because I don't have a hotel room. Sidney offered to put him up for the house in his room because he said, the next day I'd like you to see one other piece of property. So he showed him that piece of property. It was adjacent to the town of Lakeview. Lakeview was on the east side of Lake Mayo, which had just been renamed Lake Osceola. The land that Loring Chase liked was on the west side. And so Loring Chase bought it and developed the town of Winter Park. Sidney was climbing pretty well by this particular time. In 1882, another Chase happened to come to town, and his name was Henry Lawrence Chase. He too was from Massachusetts. Let me back up. I guess I should qualify Loring. Loring was born in New Hampshire. Both parents were deceased by the time he was 2, so he moved to Massachusetts and was raised by an aunt and uncle, or one or the other. So he was raised in Massachusetts. Knew very little bit about his parents, although I did find his mother and father's name. Loring Chase eventually went to Chicago, where he made his first big money in real estate. Henry Lawrence Chase was born in Lynn, Massachusetts. And we also know that the father of the Chase siblings was born in Massachusetts. So all 3 families were from New England. Were they related? I'm sure they were somewhere along the line. I have gone back as far as I can and invested as much time, because you wanted me to start on time tonight. I ran just simply after months and months. I just could not find a connection, but I'm sure far enough back there were. Henry Chase was a corporate secretary investor in the Altamont Land Navigation and Hotel Company. The Altamont was 1,000 acres, and it eventually became Altamont Springs. So we have Chase families in Winter Park, Sanford, and Altamont Springs in the earliest years of their development. By 1883, Sidney purchased 1,700 acres, and at that point in time they were selling about $1 an acre, I think, in what is now Lake County. It was Sumter County back then. Some of the land was up around Lake Mineola. Most of the land was right alongside Lake Louise, actually on both sides of the area. And at the same time he bought that, Charles H. Morse bought 10,000 acres in this particular area. Almost all of it West Orange County and what is now Lake County. Big plans were going on for this. At that particular time, another investor was James Ingraham. So there were plans for a railroad to come through this area, in addition to, at that time, the Orange Belt Railway came through, and the Tavares, Apopka and Gulf Railroad was heading this way. Planned, it had yet to start. So there was a huge development plans for this area, and Sidney, this was his very first land investment. This, in 1884, Sidney bought additional land, but this time he did not buy it himself. Joshua Randall and Anna Adamson, at that time, their sister, all 4 of them bought land. It was almost 400 acres, I believe, and the land was in the area of Fort Davenport, not Davenport, Florida, the town, because it is not where they bought this land, this section, and this section. Other individuals that were buying up in this area were James Ingraham, and I think there was a Whitner. But the land in this area had been developed or surveyed originally by Benjamin F. Whitner. This, oddly enough, this was the trail that came through Fort Davenport, and it was actually called the Lake Monroe to Tampa Road. Now I'll show you where that land is today. Fort Davenport is basically on an on-ramp to the 429 if you were heading north on I-4, and all this area here was the land that they were buying up for, presumably, orange groves. And for the longest time, this area was a very large citrus grower. So here we come to an early ad by Chase, and I show this because it says established 1883, and they also show general insurance. Randall Chase was the insurance man who came from Philadelphia with his brothers and sister. And by this time, Chase and Company was formed, and it was Sidney, Joshua, and Randall Chase, the three brothers. I did not find any necessary record that Anna was involved in it. She may have been, though. By 1884, Sidney and Joshua had formed the Chase and Company. They were based out of Sanford, and they were the state agents for the Shoemaker Phosphate Company, which was a very large Philadelphia, Pennsylvania fertilizing company. So they were handling all of the state of Florida for the Shoemaker Company of Philadelphia. In 1886, Sidney shows up. He's 26 years old now. He shows up as a general land agent for the South Florida Railroad, responsible for 849 town lots plus 571,000 acres. Moving along quite well, because Ingraham at that time is president of the South Florida Railroad, and he doesn't have time to deal with the land sales, because by 1886 he was trying to figure out how to get through into and out of the Everglades. So by this time, Sidney Chase has really climbed the ladder, and he is doing quite well with his own company as well as working for the South Florida Railroad Company. In 1890, Sanford had a Sanborn insurance map prepared. If you've ever done any research or found historians, they love to reference Sanborn insurance maps because they show buildings, where they are, and exactly the size. They're really a historical document. And this is a Sanford map of February 1890. Interesting, though, is that it was signed off by Chase and Company. So Chase and Company was in not only an insurance company, but now they were signing off on Sanborn maps. In 1893, they purchased another piece of information, or a piece of property, which I first got started in, and that was what came to be known as the Isleworth Grove, down around Windermere and Waco. And at that time, the Florida Midland Railway was running right through Windermere and Waco. And so this right in here was one of the first areas that they purchased, but they expanded quite rapidly to become what is today Isleworth. So in 1894, for the first time, Joshua Chase marries, and he married Sarah Jane Whitner. This really started getting my interest because I have written numerous books and articles about the Whitner family. They were one family that just absolutely intrigues me as to their extensive involvement in the development of Orange County. Unfortunately, in 1894, she died at the age of 23. But the next year, Sidney Chase married her sister, Laura Duval Whitner. Sarah and Jane and Laura were daughters of Benjamin F. Whitner III, the son of the man who did all of the surveying in Orange County. And they were all descendants of an American Revolution patriot as well. So this is quite a patriotic family we're developing here. And then, as we all know, in 1894-95, within about a 6-week period, came 2 freezes. And it absolutely destroyed citrus crop shipments here in Central Florida. By that time, Chase and Company was being referred to as the largest fruit shipping business in Florida when everything stopped. Not only were the trees, or the fruit damaged, the trees had split, and the second freeze froze the sap, which destroyed they thought destroyed many of the trees. As it turned out, as time passed, they found out that the trees in Isleworth were not damaged quite to the extent of death. But it took a while for them to ever realize that extent. But think about it, in 1894-95, here they were with all this land, all these groves, they couldn't ship fruit, and Joshua was a widower already. Basically, almost anybody in Orange County lost everything they had. The description of what people went through, they were destitute, bankrupt, many couldn't handle it. Many just left. Between 1890 and the year 1900, Orange County's population actually dropped. In a 10-year period, after 10 years, there were fewer people living in 1900 in Orange County than there were in 1890. It was that bad. People just left. So after the freeze, Joshua, a widower, he just left himself. He went to Los Angeles and became a fruit dealer for Earl Fruit Company in Los Angeles. Sidney and his family stayed here. Joshua did remarry in 1904 to a widow. The widow Mary Justice Lee, and he became the stepfather for William Justice Lee, an interesting individual that I'll be bringing up in a moment or two. When Joshua did return, finally to Florida, he settled in Jacksonville. Did not come here at first. So the Chase siblings, Joshua is located in Jacksonville, Sidney was in Sanford, and Randall Chase went into partnerships with William Randolph Harney, the 1-year-old who came in 1869 with Will Wallace Harney. They went into the insurance business in Miami. So in Miami, they started out, they were the oldest agency in Miami. It probably only took a day or two. I mean, Miami hardly existed when they went down there, so it didn't take them too long to become the oldest insurance agency, but they were the oldest insurance agency. And then they actually started Chase and Harney fruit and vegetable packers down in Miami. And so they became crate dealers. So these two guys, Randall and William, became rather involved in the fruit business in Miami at that particular time. That was 1906. By this time, Sidney was starting to get back on his feet, and Joshua was starting to get back on his feet in Jacksonville. So this is what I'm talking about. The people that built American Dream the first time, they lost everything in the freeze, and yet they came back. They built in Winter Park a packing house. But to run the packing house, Joshua, who was living in Jacksonville, sent his stepson. His stepson was William Justice Lee, a lieutenant in the Navy Reserve, an individual who was fascinated by radio. And he tinkered with radio to the extent that he set up a station in his own home in Winter Park. And in his home, William Justice Lee, with the Chase and Company as executive, sent out the very first broadcast from Central Florida. Not only that, he stuck with it. He got involved with Rollins College, and together they formed the very first radio station, way down by Orlando, right? Isn't that? WDBO was founded by William Justice Lee, and every single article that it mentions his founding of WDBO mentions that he is of Chase and Company, the general manager of Winter Park. From there, because the railroad line was the lifeblood of the citrus industry, if you grew oranges, you had to get them onto a train to get them to the market. Orlando became the next logical place for them to establish a railroad, a depot, and a packing house. So by 1924, the Chase and Company was starting to run ads in almost every single newspaper in the state of Florida. They were in Bradenton, Cocoa, Fort Myers, Miami, Tampa, and then some. And for the first time, they started using the name Sunniland as a trademark. They were all, from there hereafter, they were known as Sunniland and Chase and Company. They seemed to keep both. I don't know that they were able to decide which exactly name that they wanted to have. But they became a statewide shipper and packer of fruit. Around the same time in 1924, they built the Ocoee packing house. I'm not sure why, but this packing house was frequently mentioned in the newspaper for fires. It was burnt and then rebuilt and burnt and rebuilt and burnt and rebuilt. I'm not really sure how many times it was burnt, but they couldn't seem to keep this particular packing house without being burnt. And in 1935, they actually bought a lot in Winter Garden, and I add this because of where we're at. Here's where we're at right here, just a couple blocks away over here. The Chase and Company bought a lot. I never could find that they ever did with it, but I thought I should throw this in here anyway, that they actually came to Winter Garden. And then they ended up added the name of Sunniland, and by this time they were heavily into fertilizers themselves, as opposed to the fruit. In 1939, William R. Harney died at Jacksonville, and at that time his obituary said he was employed 53 years with Chase and Company as the Secretary, Treasurer, Vice President, and Director throughout his term with him. 70 years prior, his father brought him across the Cumberland Gap at 1 year old when there was hardly anybody living in this particular area. In 1940, Randall Chase died at the age of 94. Chase family had good genes. Sidney died at the age of 80, and Anna Lucia Chase Adamson died at the age of 91. Joshua was the elder of the group. He passed in 1848. I was 1 year old at the time. I don't remember him, but he died at the age of 89. That's the Chase and Company. I will be more than happy to try and answer any questions that you may have. As I said, I love Central Florida history, and what I found more than anything about the Chase family is this. They didn't take no for an answer just because their business failed. They were determined to make it again, and they ended up becoming probably one of the largest packers and shippers in the state of Florida twice. Once in the 19th century and again in the 20th century. And they ventured out from there. Siblings of the family were all named the same. So sometimes you might see a Randall Chase, and you have to think, all right, well, this must be the grandson or the son or whatever. They thought very highly of their siblings, so they like to name their kids after one another. Anybody have any particular questions? Golly, this went a little fast. Yes.
Who was the other gentleman standing with brothers and Anna?
I believe that was the husband of Anna, Mr. Adamson. But the photo that I have does not have him identified. They didn't have any of the kids identified, but through other identified pictures, I was able to put together who was who, except for that one individual. But I believe he pretty much stayed in Philadelphia in his business dealings. Yes?
You won't say it, so His grandfather worked for Chase and Company in Sam.
Okay.
After World War I.
Okay.
We've got Chase family here, but did anybody work for Chase and Company? So this,
They were huge employers. A big part of the people in Florida worked for Chase and Company.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are associated with them.
Yeah.
Bel Air was where my grandfather was a foreman for the cruise. And not to get too far afield, but one of the resources that I found that had a tremendous amount of information was world fairs. And there was always these big displays of world fairs. And when after the freeze in Bel Air, they shifted to celery.
Right.
Chase and Company got into it. And Chase and Company made Sanford the world capital of celery until it was taken to Oviedo. And it was my family that my grand swamp in Oviedo and moved the celery operations there. But Chase and Company was big, and so if you go to the World's Fair literature and everything, you'll see,
Right.
you know, they put these gaudy displays on, you know, of their celery, and, you know, of course, Sanford, you know, they're bragging that it was still Orange County then. And, you know, they were bragging about being the world celery capital.
Yeah. Yeah, that celery is what they picked up after their first citrus was lost. An interesting thing about Sanford, Henry Sanford, is that he didn't live in Orange County. All the deeds for property sales that he made for lots he and his wife sold from Jacksonville. They lived in Jacksonville. So the Sanfords wanted to build this town out here in this wilderness. They just didn't want to live in their town, apparently. So really, when you think about the Whitners and the Chases and the Trafford, some lady told me Trafford was not a very good guy, so I almost hesitate mentioning his name. I guess he took off and left a wife and 2 kids here and went out west. And when he died, his wife tried to file for a pension, and his wife was already getting a pension. But he also had a wife back in England. So I normally don't like to talk too much about A.R. Trafford, but still he played a very important role in the earliest days of laying things out. And it was Trafford and Benjamin Whitner who decided the route of the railroad, the very same route that the Sunrail runs today. That's how important they were to laying out how Central Florida was going to develop. It was they were that instrumental in it. And Bel Air was quite interesting. There was an article of a news reporter who went to Bel Air in around 1888, and he wrote extensively of it. Had a really nice railroad depot and a grand entrance, and they went in. They had everything laid out for food because they were entertaining news reporters. They wanted to show it in its best light. And this gentleman wrote up about how incredible the citrus grove was because they brought trees from everywhere. I mean, there were orange trees from almost around the world that were planted there as test trees to see which ones were going to work. So if you had a relative working there, he no doubt had a big job on his hand.
The real estate part of it, the houses, going back to the number of people that were employed by Chase and Company, they gave the workers housing. So they built these little small town little shacks for the field workers and all. And like I said, that's what my grandfather got involved because he basically ran the town and controlled the field workers.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Did you have a question?
I did want to ask about Freeze, the surveyor.
About what?
Freeze, F-R-I-E-S.
Do you have any more information about that?
John Otto. Oh yeah, there's a lot of information in a couple of my books about him. But John Otto Freeze had come over from Sweden. He came in 1871 for the first time. By 1871, there was already a lot of articles in Europe about Orlando, the potential of Central Florida. So he came here for that reason, and he was a civil engineer back there, where he came from, and so he came to Central Florida, check it out, and worked here for a while. Got a job as Orange County surveyor. only one museum that I know of has the 1890 map, and that is, I keep telling it, any museum that has an opportunity should get one of these maps downloaded from the Library of Congress, because it's about yay wide, but he prepared a detailed map of Orange County in 1890, showed some houses. One of the houses, for example, is he shows the house of James G. Spear, the founder of Oakland, where he shows where it is. He shows Winter Garden as one word, but hey, he was a surveyor, not an author. He shows the town of Creston, which I had done a presentation years ago. It was going to be a town south of here, and it was going to be a railroad hub. It didn't make it, so Winter Garden did. Interesting piece of history. But James Otto Fries lived until, I believe it was the 1920s or so. He actually went down and did some surveying in the Everglades. He was very active right up until the time of his death, and probably one of the most significant surveyors of Orange County, because he left so much. As a historian, I use plats a lot that are downloaded from Orange County, and his name's on a lot of those plats. So he was a very interesting individual. He had a daughter named Tina, and she wrote a book in 1938 called Orlando of Long, Long Ago. More entertaining than historical, but it does have some history if you pick it apart and check it all out.
Which museum has the map, the 1890 map?
The map, if you go to the Seminole County Historical Society, they have it on a wall there. Every time I go, I look at it and say, and I've told Central Florida Railroad Museum, why don't we have one of these maps? And they said, well, we don't have any more wall space. You have to find a place that has some wall space there. But it's a great map, a great map. If you're ever in Seminole County Historical Society, somebody says, what's this Orange County, what's this doing here? Well, Seminole County was Orange County until 1913. And so everything that started out north of Orange County was Orange County up until 1913. Yes?
What happened to all the land England owned? They just sold it?
What happened to all the what?
Land in Central Florida that England owned?
I would imagine in time, and maybe some Chase family members can tell me, I would imagine some of it in time they sold. A lot of it they may have lost. A lot of developers lost the land because that they owned prior to the freeze, because it was cheaper to just let it go back. And so a lot of the acreage was sold by court orders at almost pennies on the dollar for the just simply a paying of the taxes. Although I don't know that for a fact as to what, as far as Chase, the Isleworth, I think they probably kept that until they sold it maybe to the residential. Did they? Do you know? A lot of the land down in Reunion, that area and all, I think was bought and sold through different orange growers because they kept trying it in different areas. Land turned over a lot throughout the years. And one of the reasons is it was really difficult to survive down here. I mean, it was very challenging. The railroads, I always love to talk about Central Florida railroads, because by 1880, there was none. Okay, none in January of 1880. By the middle of the 1890s, there was 37 different railroads crisscrossing everywhere around here. Some were drawn on paper and didn't get the first track laid, but most of them had at least portions of it completed. So, and then one by one, they all started failing because 1887, there was a yellow fever. In 1895, there was a freeze, and those things affected the train traffic. And train traffic affected the ability to get your produce to market. If you couldn't get it to market, you couldn't survive. And so those things caused ups and downs in the economy all throughout the 19th and 20th century. All the way up to, I came here in 1971, and I wasn't here for 3 months, and we had an oil embargo. And I had just opened a business and had to shut the doors because there was no business. And Disney World was supposed to make us all rich, but not so to some people who were trying to make a business go. So there's always been economic downturns that affected this area too largely. Yes.
On the map that showed the Isle Road there, the Waco, is that kind of where Kings Point is now? I think you were touching on Waco in Joestown's presentation.
And for which one of it?
Waco.
Oh, Waco, yeah. Okay. Let me find it here. That was supposed to be up forward. This is going to be the list of the number of my books that had Chase families in it. Okay, so this is the Waco. Waco was established by the way, by a guy who, you might have guessed it, but he was born in Waco. He planted an orange grove down here, and the Chases ended up buying from him, right? Yeah. And Griffin was another big family who was out in Winter Garden. They also bought from them. So your question about it?
Yeah, just wondering if it was an actual settlement, or if it was just marked as Waco in the town, or if it was...
Waco is long gone. Right now, I don't have... The clubhouse to Isleworth is right about here, I believe. Right near Lake Bessie, as best I can. So Waco's long gone. The railroad is long gone. The railroad used to go right down the center of downtown Windermere, but Waco's long gone. This was 1890, but this is all the Isleworth private residential community now.
So it was just absorbed by that.
You what?
Waco was just absorbed by...
Yes, it was just a depot and a one man's dream of a town, which was not unusual for Central Florida. Between 1880 and the year 1900, those 20 years, there were 200 towns in Orange County, 200 wannabe towns that just didn't make it. Anybody else?
General Sanford was given a large land grant by the government because of his service as ambassador to Brussels or something.
No.
And the Chases, the big amount of property that they got in the Sanford area was through General Sanford and that land grant.
All right. Well, we got to go back to 1832 to tell the story of Sanford. At that particular time, a guy by the name of Moses Elias Levy came from Morocco, and he was given a land grant by Spain of 60-some thousand acres. And they drew they had a map, and they drew where different chunks of his land was going to be. Moses had this idea that he was going to have a land for the persecuted Jews in Europe. Yeah, they were persecuted all the way back then. He was going to bring them all over and live on this land. The United States government said, no, your grant is not legitimate. So from 1832 right up until the year 1850, that land was on hold. And in 1850, the United States Supreme Court said his grant is legitimate. Well, by 1850, Sanford had already been surveyed. So the United States Supreme Court ordered the surveyors to go back and eliminate their survey and just show one blob of land. When they did that, a corner of the Levy grant included the pier at Mellonville. So the gentleman who had established the town of Mellonville, his homestead was eliminated and he took off. And so now everything was in a mess, and this was in 1850. By that time, Moses Elias Levy was so old he didn't want to deal with it anymore, so he sold it to General Finnegan, Florida's brigadier general. So Finnegan owned this 12,000 acre block. on the south shore of Lake Monroe. Finnegan held on to it for 20 years until 1870 when he sold that 12,000 to Henry Sanford. When Henry Sanford came down here, and this isn't talked about a whole lot, but Henry Sanford was a northerner. And the people here in 1870, with the Civil War just over, they didn't like a whole lot of the northerners too well. And so, therefore, he had a tough time getting off the ground with his community until he sold it to England, and England came back and colonized Sanford. Go figure. History, they say, repeats itself, right? And so that's the whole story. It just evolved. It was the same exact 12,000 acres that transpired from 1832 all the way up until 1870 when Sanford bought it. And in 1880 when the English bought it.
Chase has got it from the English?
And then, well, Chase now, remember in 1880 when the English bought it, Sidney Chase was 19 years old and had only been here for 2 years. So he was a laborer, basically. He worked on the Bel Air, on the grove that Henry Sanford established, called Bel Air. And he worked there as a laborer. And then in time, you know, what makes you feel good, what every entrepreneur makes, what makes every entrepreneur feel good is when you can buy the grove where you used to work or the business that you used to work. And that's what he did. He ended up, the Chase family ended up owning Bel Air eventually. Do I?
They bought it from the widow.
The widow, yeah, right. Yeah. And I think it was probably pretty run down by the time they got it. Yeah. And that Bel Air is today Crystal Lake, just in Lake Mary area, just north of Lake Mary, to give you an idea. The train. Yeah. Well, what was the Grove, Bel Air Grove, was right on Lake Crystal Lake, and where the train track comes right through to Lake Mary area, right before it gets to Lake Mary coming south. Anybody? Well, I certainly appreciate it. I hope you liked it. Yes?
Okay, so the book you're writing, the chances are going to be there.
Well, my next book will be out next fall, and it's going to be called simply Floridians, and it's going to be a book. I've written about so many different individuals, but this is going to be about important individuals throughout the state of Florida that has shaped the state of Florida as to what it is today. I'll bring one. Maybe I can talk to Jim into let me come back next November, and I'll bring copies. Yes, sir. There you are. I did a talk in Sanford at the library, but that was, oh, okay. Oviedo. That's a hard area to crack. I haven't been able to. Yeah. What they do here is fantastic, and I have to give that man right back there in the corner, I think his name is Jim, credit for had these talks and all because this is such a great area for for history, and it's great what this organization does. You said, yes, sir.
No rush. I just wanted to say, this is pursuant to what you're talking about. We have quite an archive in the back here. We have magazines, books, newspapers going back to the 1880s, all about citrus, the whole industry. Just there is so much to know and learn about, and it's open to folks just like yourselves. It's free research. You just come in, we pull out items, we give you the gloves, and we let you look, and you make copies if you need to. So there is really so much to learn. When you get more interested in why, like I say, we're here, why this whole town is here. The story is so fascinating, and we have all the background. Just donated to us by people who, like I say, worked in the groves, owned the groves, owned the packing houses, worked in the packing houses. Everybody's got a story, and we have so much of it recorded. And we would love for people to come in hands-on, just research it and learn more about it. The
Not just-
stories are fascinating.
Not
Just
just
give us a
Orange
call.
County?
Say again?
Not just Orange County?
It's mostly Orange County, yeah. West Orange County particularly, but it stretches into Lake County. So many families are related, as we've learned tonight, so there's a lot to know and learn. So give us a call, we'll pull the files. It's easy to do. We would love to share what we have in our secret archive with you all. So.
Now, if you go outside of Orange County, though, if you go to Lake County, we just happen to have here the mayor of Tavares. Stand up, Bob. And he also has the Tavares History Research Center in downtown Tavares, where you can get Lake County information. Anybody else from historical societies here? There are great historical societies, and there are great organizations trying to improve their historical societies. And so I really highly suggest, if wherever you are, check out and see. I know Sanford has a great one. Right 2 blocks from here, there's a great railroad museum, really great railroad museum. When you think about the fact right outside this window here where that caboose is, a train used to run right down there. A train that really built up this whole and this whole area here. And so the individual, to me, it's the individuals who made all that happen that is really fascinating. But any other questions? I certainly appreciate and thank you, and I hope you at least learned something new. Thank you.